Hello and welcome to the show, where today we're going to be focusing on the supply chain. Now, no organization is an island. Okay, perhaps with the exception of a UK high street frozen food supermarket and an international fashion retailer. Little known fact, actually, River Island was created in 1988 from the amalgamation of two high street fashion stores, Chelsea Girl and Concept Man. Remember Concept Man? Anyway, apart from those, no organization is an island. Each of us is reliant on sending and receiving goods or information with third-party suppliers to enable us to go about our business. Now, from a cyber risk and information security point of view, many organizations, frankly, have their hands quite full enough keeping across their own workforce and systems. But what about when your business relies on critical information flowing between other businesses and their workforce too? Well, that is our topic for today. And speaking of a man on an island, joining me, as always, is our very own Concept Man, Meta Compliance Chief Evangelist and author of Cybersecurity Awareness for Dummies, Robbie O'Brien. Hello, Robbie.
Hi, David. How the hell are you?
I'm really good. Thank you very much indeed. My own Concept Man. I'm so pleased you're here.
I thought the man on the island was giving it away. You know, over here on the other island beside the UK. Well, look, we've a really interesting topic today, and it's one that I have been looking forward to drilling into for a while, because everybody's focused on their own perimeter security. They're looking to set things right within their own house, so to speak. But there've been an awful lot of breaches that have originated from trusted partners. And where the diligence might not have been as good as it should have been when those partners, those suppliers were set up. Anyway, it's a great topic for us to cover.
Indeed. And helping us to cover it is our special guest for today, cybersecurity leader, consultant, and current head of cybersecurity GRC at National Highways in the UK. It's Matt Villian. Hello, Matt.
Greetings. How are we doing there?
Great to have you on board. Just tell us a bit about yourself, Matt. Clearly, National Highways in the UK, part of, I guess, what many people would call the critical national infrastructure here. And you've worked in and around that sort of area for a little while in terms of governmental organisations.
Yeah, so I've been consulting to government now for about 15 to 16 years across many of the major government departments. And I find myself leading the governance, risk and compliance for cybersecurity in National Highways at the moment, which is quite interesting because everyone thinks of roads not having technology, but actually there's a lot of technology, especially when you get into things like tunnels.
Good stuff. And Matt, I'm going to come to you first of all with perhaps a deceptively simple question to begin with. Let's see. We talk about supply chain this, supply chain that, but what do we actually mean? Do we really know what we mean when we talk about the supply chain? And do we really all mean the same thing, do you think?
Wow, that is quite a question. I think answering the second half of that question first, which is, do we actually talk the same thing? I think the answer is absolutely not. The supply chain is so different for every organization out there on the planet. Whether you are a small business or whether you're something like National Highways. Now, in National Highways, you've got major projects like if they're building like the Lower Thames Crossing, you've got a massive tunnel, massive infrastructure, thousands of people involved, and it's a complex supply chain, down to the local supermarket who's doing their accounts on QuickBooks or something like that. There's all supply chain, and there's cyber risk buried in all of it. So I think, no, the answer is absolutely not. Nobody actually truly understands their supply chain because there's always the secondary and the tertiary suppliers, and then they've got secondary and tertiary suppliers as well. So you end up with this nested quagmire of suppliers all delivering one or two small pieces. And hopefully you end up with a cohesive service off the back end of it and secure.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to that piece around categorization and strategies that we try to employ to understand what we look like, where we sit inside this sprawling web of suppliers and like you say, secondary, tertiary, and goodness knows how many other suppliers as well. But Robbie, same question to you really. What's your take on this supply chain question? Because it is one of those terms that I guess could mean something really specific, but I have a hunch just gets thrown around as a big umbrella term for lots of different types of things.
I think when people talk about supply chain, they immediately start thinking about, big ships coming from China and the Suez Canal getting blocked and the Houthis firing missiles at oil tankers. And that's what gets on the television, right? And it's real. There's no doubt about that. And we've just gone through a number of years of great upset to that really finely adjusted, just-in-time supply concept. I think when we talk about cybersecurity, it isn't so much that supply aspect of it. It's more the elements that constitute the digital connections between these various entities. And like a lot of things in this area, it's the detail is where the problem lies. So I started out my career in the procurement department in that whole selecting suppliers for the aircraft industry, and that is a very old industry. Buying things for construction or for government is an old industry. It's hundreds of years old, and cybersecurity is tens of years old, right? It's brand new, and so the purchasing department, the procurement guys, a really, really big role to play in how we adopt a new supplier. However, I don't necessarily think that they believe that they're part of the supply defense mechanism, and there's a big disconnect. And likewise, I don't think the guys that are choosing systems or the cybersecurity management necessarily always remember about the procurement department, or they do remember about the legal guys, because everything gets held up by the legal guys, right? You need to get the contracts through. But the person who typically sends out the risk register is when the contract is being signed is the procurement department. And I think where it falls down is that, like a lot of compliance, if you can get it into a tick box process, you're good, and don't worry about it, forget about it. But as the cyber threats have evolved, I think that needs to be revisited, and the joins between the next level down for the joins between the departments and who's responsible and why it matters is really, really important.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come on to the evolution of the threats, particularly with regards to the sprawling nest of services that we spoke about a moment ago in a moment. But really just to come back on a point that I think you were making, Matt, about the growth of this supply chain exposure. There's some data from the DCMS, UK government, their 2022 security breaches survey. Just over 1 in 10 businesses review the risks posed by their immediate suppliers. That's just over 1 in 10, 13%. And the proportion for the wider supply chain is half of that figure. These are infinitesimally small numbers of organizations that really do this piece of supply chain analysis. So my question to you really is, what are some of the strategies that you've seen organizations employing to try and get a grip on these sprawling supply chains and just even begin to comprehend their risk and their exposure?
For me, it comes down to information, because I never liked the term cybersecurity. I always thought that was a misnomer, because if you have no information, then you don't have a cyber risk. So it is always coming back to, what information are you processing? And that question's not immediately evident, because even if you're buying paper clips, there is information that's flowing between you and that supplier, like a bank account detail or something along the lines of that. And what we're seeing out in the world is a flip from digital deception back into analog deception, where they will now send you a paper invoice rather than a digital invoice to try and get you to pay for something that you never ordered. So where people have become aware of email threats and the invoices along those, they're now sending back to paper. So it always comes down to understanding the information and what is the information that's going between the two organizations. Because if you do not understand your dependency on the information, and when you're looking at something like a local council where they're making decisions that affect real people's lives, or a large government department, you've got to understand the information. And if the purity of that information changes, you might be changing somebody's life by making incorrect decisions off the back end of that. And when you outsource a function, that becomes doubly so important. And then you've got to ensure that the data quality between, say, a citizen and the local council or the government department is maintained and pure. And then the contract clauses to attempt to keep that pure becomes a supply chain problem. And it's quite complex to drive that through.
It's one of those things where you try and deal with the risk by putting it into the clauses in a contract.
Yes.
And once you do it, because from my experience, the only time the contract is brought back to the light of day is when things have gone horribly wrong.
Horribly wrong, yes.
And, you know, that's failure. So they are the clauses aren't really the place to guide behaviors. It isn't the place to try and guide how the parties should interact with one another. And I mean, I've been in many situations where, you know, you have somebody who is involved in the contract initiation, you know, whatever service or product, and then it goes to the people who are using it or implementing it, and they've never read the contract. So they and it's nearly like starting from scratch, as if we're having a new thing, right? That's are we going to do it this way? And so there's another process of re-education. So I think you're right. It's a complex problem, and it always goes back to, you know, what is the information that is important, and how do you make that information the piece that you protect?
Okay, so I'm going to push on this point, because I get the point about, you know, making sure that the contract is watertight, or at least understanding what's in the contract. And you mentioned there about how very often these are only analysed when the fit hits the shan, whatever instance that may be. But what if you are helicoptered into an organization, maybe they are in the midst of a breach or otherwise, and you are faced with trying to catalog, trying to understand? Your job in whatever role you are there in is to try and do that bit of work that kicks off the process, that helps you understand what your supply chain looks like. What do you recommend there? Do you recommend tiering? Are you having to go out to department heads and try and delegate this to those who are closer to the third-party suppliers? What are some of the things that you can do to bring together this horrific picture?
If you're being helicoptered in, one of the most important things is getting local information about what's important. It's quite interesting. If you go into organizations, you'll find that the organization itself does not understand how it does business or what's important. But you can get down to individuals within the services who understand how and what is important within it. Drawing that out from the organization to try and get that map is the art of a supply chain manager. There's very few of them around in the market. I've met a few, and they've done really good jobs in actually trying to ascertain that. One thing I have seen as a trend in the industry itself is that the commercial and procurement people sign off a contract and then they file it, and then they move on to the next one and making sure that that one's good. Unless there is a conscious choice by the organization to go, well, before we file it, we should write down what that means to us in our supply chain map. It's lost, because as soon as it's filed, everyone's moved on to the next thing. So I'm always a big proponent for proper change management. When you bring on a supplier, that's a change.
Yeah.
Write down what that change means to the organization and how it relates to it all. So we've got the GDPR rules around, if you're processing personal information, if you change your sub-suppliers, you've got to let me know about what you're up to on that. It's the same kind of thing. That information quite often goes to a dead end. Why not take that opportunity to write it down in the change control to draw out the map? It doesn't take a lot, but that can save you if there is a major incident going on, because you can now start to see what the chain looks like. And then you can say, well, I need to reach that supplier down there. How do I get down to that level down the bottom? So understanding the territory before an incident is probably one of the most important things.
And then in terms of, so you've got a map of, you've relied upon local knowledge, not necessarily what is written down in a central system, because who knows if that's kept up to date or not. And you understand that, hey, I'm connected to this supplier who may well be reliant upon these cloud service providers, whatever it is. What about the data flows? What about the information that flows across those boundaries as well? Because that strikes me as that's potentially a different set of gravy, different bowl of gravy altogether.
Yeah, well, it is a totally
boat of gravy. That's what I was looking for. A different boat of gravy.
You were going to nail that.
It was
that sort of metaphor.
You're absolutely right. Once you understand the supply chain, then it's what are these people or organizations to you? What information are you getting? And what business decisions are you making off the back of the information that you get? And it's not always immediately obvious. Even just getting an invoice from somebody, that invoice that comes in is information. That information, if it's modified on the way in, could mean that you're paying incorrectly if you don't have a proper validation process, or even you've received a letter. This is another attack that's going on at the moment, saying, by the way, our organization has moved, we're in new offices, we've changed our bank as well. Can you please pay all new payments to this new bank account? On a nice formal letter. Once again, I have poisoned your information systems. And unless there is the validation process to go off and validate that information that's coming into the organization, once again, that's a supply chain attack.
I think if you take your earlier question and we go back to macro, currently across the globe, you have governments looking at their supply chains and going, where do we get our critical thing from? Be it energy, be it steel, whatever. And that's why you have an almost sort of reconfiguration to countries like South America and Vietnam instead of China. So like that's happening at a national level. And if you go down into an organizational level, it's the same thing. Where are we getting our stuff from? Who is important to me? What countries are they in? If you take that back to your supply chain and you say, okay, well, what's the 20% of my suppliers that I have digital connection with or information connections with that I'm processing data with? And you typically find that they are your big ones, and they are the ones that make up your make up the sort of flows of critical information between you and them. And then those are the ones you really need to get on top of really, really quickly. And I agree with Matt. Very few organizations sit down and go to the bother of mapping that out and, putting risk on those various suppliers, because that's, I think, where the problem occurs. Because if you go and do it, you'll immediately get yourself a whole pile of work, because you'll find that there are problems there and you'll have to go fix it. And I think that's one of the big problems with cybersecurity. No one wants any more problems. There's too much work as it is.
Already. Yeah. So one of the problems I've always seen when outsourcing is I always say that you can outsource blame, but you can't outsource risk. No. And quite often when people are buying a service, they wrap it up and say, well, it's their problem. They've got to deal with all of this. Well, in the end, if their service goes down because of X, Y, or Z, it's still that's you that are impacted on that. So you have a vested interest in them and how they do business, because you are dependent on them as part of the supply chain. And it's all very well to say, well, we outsourced it, it's all of their fault. Great, but that doesn't help you today. It's still your information that was lost. Like Nordic Cloud, I will mention them. They are in the news a few months ago. They were a cloud provider in the Nordic countries, and they got ransomware hit, and it destroyed everything. It encrypted their entire operating systems, all of their data, And unfortunately, they suffered massive losses off the back end of that. And if you're a customer of them and you've outsourced to their cloud services, it's your data that's been lost. So once again, you've outsourced to the cloud, but it's still your risk. You can say they went down, it wasn't us, but that doesn't help you in the end. You've still got to look after your own information and make sure that your organization understands its own risk profile.
As the old saying goes, it's not the cloud, it's somebody else's computer. That is very, very true.
Who said that?
I love it. So let's turn to employees for a moment. And of course, workforces have had to deal with new vendors as a result of all this working from home stuff that's been going on. Look back at the beginning of the pandemic. Organizations were really scrambling to keep their employees connected by deploying collaboration, remote working, and various SaaS services at real speed. Sometimes, I think it's fair to say, without the due diligence that might ideally have taken place. Things like Zoom and Teams and BlueJeans and 8x8, WebEx, Google Meet, the list went on and on. That pandemic is now, thankfully, touch wood, behind us, but there is still churn, particularly in the end user compute area, where I think organizations are still very much consolidating and crystallizing on what their new normal working practices look like. And Robbie, churn is change. Change is risk. We've just spoken about change controls here. Risk, particularly for a workforce that's at the front line of having to adapt to all of these changes.
Completely. I mean, prior to COVID, we spent the 15 years before that talking about bring your own device.
Yes.
And everyone who had an IT estate was battling with typically their senior people trying to connect their iPads to corporate networks, and why won't this system work? And I mean, it was almost a farcical thing, right? It was for anyone in the industry, it was a farcical thing, and we all sort of like, oh, what do you do about it? And there was really no solution to it, right? You were what we were doing is we had a walking retreat, and everybody was giving in and giving in and giving in, and COVID came along, and just drove a coach and horses through the whole thing, and we've just hit the fast forward 10 years, and now everybody's at home. Connecting over their own router in an environment where you can't see where the laptop is. We used to worry about people going into cafes with a laptop. Now you've no idea. And then who has access within that physical environment, and then what are the people doing? And for me, one of my passions, which is needs to be talked about at another time, is policy management, right? And Matt and I go back a long time talking about this, where we sort of have the same view, because no one ever wrote a policy without there being a risk. So therefore you go, what are your risks? Then you got to tell people, and I think that's, for me, is the biggest, scariest thing, is that the whole world changed without any rules, without any guidelines, and no one that I have seen has really caught up and rewritten all their policies, because it's sort of on the too hard sort of pile. And also you'd have to start making decisions as well. So do you allow this and do you allow that? And it just takes you into the whole, how many days do people work in the office? Bigger problem, which no one really wants to get. HR is dealing with that, and each company deals with it differently. But it's a very, very hot topic, and I think that's where we have to go back to. We have to go back to, first principles, and go, what are the risks now that we're dealing with, and how do we systematically, bring those risks to an acceptable level.
So when Robbie was talking about the BYOD, it made me think about the fact that's still it's all about the information, because if your BYOD only allows you to access the lunch menu, then it's not really a problem. But if you can get into the corporate jewels and then modify the finance system, that changes things. And when he was talking about using AI for writing code, that's a supply chain issue. because your supplier is ChatGPT or Copilot, or I think one of the latest ones, Devlin or something like that. There's I watched a demo the other day where they asked it in plain English to write code. It wrote code. It didn't work. It then inserted debug commands, ran the debug commands, worked out what was wrong, fixed the code, and then delivered the end result. And I'm sitting back going, I'm not quite sure what I just saw there, but that scares me. But the point is, you've got a different supplier delivering that code. You have no assurance around what the quality of the code is. Now, I expect the code is really good because it's written by an AI, and that's a gathering of thousands of hours of knowledge. But still, the question has to be asked, can you trust it? When you got software components, I do want to go in down to the software components, because you brought in software writing encoders here. We all know about Log4j and the chaos that tiny little component hit a few years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic. Not many people are talking about the XZ vulnerability. And if you don't know what that is, you need to go and type in XZ. It's the new Log4j. And the attack, once again, it's a supply chain attack because it's attacking the fundamentals of communication into Linux.
Right.
As I say, if there's any listeners out there that are using Linux and you haven't heard about XZ, type it into Google.
Wow. Thank you. Breaking news here. As always, sort of. Yeah, thank you. Look, let's talk about instance. If a bad actor does somehow use the XZ exploit to crack a hole into your infrastructure, then well, you've got an incident on your hands. And Robbie, we've spoken in the past about how best to prepare for what happens should your organization fall victim to an attack or a breach. Things like table exercises, comms plans, making sure they're all in place and all that sort of good stuff. And it's all well and good going through those processes if it's your company that's had the exposure. But going back to this supply chain topic, what if it's not your company, but one of your suppliers that's gone into lockdown or has experienced a breach, potentially including your data? What sort of processes should we be putting in place then? Because that strikes me as if it's a different set of policies, a different set of exercises, or is it? Is it fundamentally the same thing?
I think it's fundamentally the same thing. If you talk, it goes back to, it all starts with information, and then not all information is equal, right? And if you know where your critical information is sitting, if it's on O365 or it's Salesforce or whatever, all well and good. I think the problem occurs where you have unique pieces of software that are coming from niche suppliers, and that sort of for a lot of people thinks, well, that's a smaller situation. But if you look at, I'm currently doing a lot of work with customers in the operational technology side of things, and you have a lot of niche suppliers who are supplying pieces of kit that are running, huge, be it production lines, sort of valves that are connected to power stations, and on and on and on the list goes. So it really is the old, impact exercise that we always have done. And I think that's another aspect of maturity. I don't think that has been done to the extent that it was, again, say 10, 15 years ago, because 10, 15 years ago, we relied on two beautiful words in the English language, air-gapped, or is it one word?
But hyphen in there.
Hyphen,
I'll give you a point for both.
It's one word. But it depends on your take on it. But air-gapped was one of those things, and I used to talk to CISOs about, but if somebody poured water and put a piece of, drove a bit of steel in there, they'd be able to connect up via, it was true air gapped. It was really, there was nothing between the computer networked and so on and so forth. But that has all been left behind in the world of IoT, has all been left behind in the world of the facility of accessing that data remotely. And I remember when it was going into plants, it wasn't talked about security at that time, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. It just wasn't talked about. It was the fascination of being able to control, a water network from your mobile phone was just amazing. And I mean, Matt, you guys must have this in terms of the telemetry that you're using for the signages and the stuff on your estate.
Oh, absolutely. So National Highways has a lot of operational technology out there. You think about this, I think there's 21,000 road segments out there, which is under jurisdiction of National Highways. I can't remember how many signs and traffic light signals. So that's all the strategic road network. And then if you multiply that out by all of the local councils and counties that have all of their own technology on the back end of it, that's a hell of a lot of technology that's out in the world. And the thing about it, you talk about the air gap, and everyone thinks now, oh, well, I'm isolated. And I'm going, well, actually you're not, because you connected it to the internet.
Yep.
And as soon as you've connected it to the internet, it's no longer an air gap, because I remember the world like you do, Robbie, where it was actually completely air gapped. There was no cable that connected this network to anything else at all, except for once every period of time there was an update, which was very, very carefully scrutinized and uploaded into the nicely air-gapped, isolated network. So you had a level of trust in those things. In today's interconnected world, it's a very different landscape, and the dependencies, there just has to be so much trust in the supply chain. There has to be. When you're looking at whether you're dealing with Microsoft or Google or any of the other cloud providers as well, there is this massive trust. I'm going to put my goodies in your other person's computer, and I hope that you do good things with it, please. And that's a lot of trust.
But I'm seeing a lot of people starting to reevaluate their cloud strategies. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at that 20% of really, really important stuff and saying, could we protect this better ourselves? Do we have the resources? And the answer is always yes. And in the light of the current situation and the scale of things, a hybrid cloud environment means something completely different than it was, again, 10 years ago, where it was people resisting going to the cloud. And now we've got this, again, because of people working from home and the original security problems. There are now scenarios where it is better that you have that system under your control and where you absolutely control the endpoints.
Yeah, supply chain security is a broader term we've used in physical supply chains for various reasons, particularly during the pandemic when we had trouble moving things around the globe from places where they're produced to places where they're consumed, but also kind of digital supply chain security. Once you begin to drill down and understand that risk, the argument for bringing stuff back in-house, or at least bringing more control around it, becomes a lot stronger in terms of justifying the potential investment in doing so, particularly after it may only be a handful of years since you outsourced it or moved it off premise in the first place.
And I think, David, there's a phrase came in, which is trusted partner, right? Where before it was suppliers, and that everybody knew what a supplier was.
Yeah.
Well, what's a trusted partner? Are they one of us? Or are they not one of us? And I think that has brought a brand new concept where, if we go back to your original question, and sorry for being long-winded and trying to answer it, but about incident management, if one of your trusted partners is down and they're managing one of your critical systems, it's the same as if you were down. No difference. The problem is you don't have as much control as if it was you were down.
So you get the worry without the franticness. So you're just sitting around waiting to see whether you can get your items back.
And as Matt says, you can outsource the blame. Oh, it was those guys, but you know the doo-doo's on your step, and you got to clean it up really, really fast.
And then going back to this time last year, you mentioned, Robbie, niche bits of software that sometimes can be all important. Of course, we had the Move It scandal last year, where it looks like lots of companies with the letter B in their name, Boots and BBC and British Airways and so on. It's like they started at one end of the alphabet and worked their way up before they got stopped. Lots of data got leaked through that as well. So, again, it can be big, major bits of software, or it can be those niche ones. I guess to your point, whether you are the custodian of the data or the system that's gone down, or it's one of your third parties, in essence, it's the information. It's the same sort of thing that you're looking at.
Yeah, it always comes down to the information. You need to understand what each supplier means to you and your dependencies in your supply, because if you're depending on a piece of information from one supplier, and to make some decisions which you then pass on to your business processes and affect other suppliers, it can have a massive knock-on consequence of the side of that.
I just want to have a little sidebar on something before we wrap up with some thoughts today. But it was something you mentioned earlier on, Matt, and I know it's something that Robbie and I have been musing on the show here lately. It's about this term cybersecurity and how useful or otherwise it can be in our line of work. What's your take on it? How did you reckon it came about, and why is it perhaps not always a helpful way of understanding the risk that our organizations and us as individuals face?
So I have a love-hate relationship with the term cybersecurity.
Okay.
And as you know, my core philosophy is it's always about the information. But in recent times, I have come to recognize that there are effectively two sets of risk registers you've got to operate. One of them is information-centric, and one of them is, I'm going to use the term, I hate it, cyber-centric. So when you've got technology issues such as like the Windows 2012 servers, which are no longer in support, that can have an effect on your information risks, but ultimately it's a dedicated technology risk. And I'm currently listing that under a cyber threat rather than as an information threat. Yeah. So I have actually changed my view on this slightly, ever so slightly, just split them and recognizing that both worlds need to exist. But it always comes down to the information, because if I got rid of all of my information, I don't have any risks.
Robbie, what's your take on this? And like I say, I know it's something that you and I have mused on the show and off it for a little while. Where do you currently sit on the information risk, security, cyber risk thing?
I'm with Matt in that information security is by far the most useful term, because there's more than just the digital. There is always going to be the patient records in folders. There's always going to be stuff printed out, stuff coming out of the printer, and once you go, it's just this, then people relax and go, I'm good. So I think it is a trendy word. It resonates. Everybody immediately thinks they know what it means. If you looked at your information as bars of gold, and they were in different rooms or different places, people would say immediately, which of the vaults are we talking about? They wouldn't be, anyway confused. And I think that's the problem with cyber. It obfuscates it and makes it sort of like more complex than it actually is. And it really is. What are those information stores, and how well are they protected?
It's like a lot of pieces of jargon that we have either in the business world or particularly in the tech world. They are sometimes a useful shorthand, but when they can become problematic is when they do, to use your word, obfuscate, when we actually use them and lose focus on what they are there to describe. And that can make the task in hand, in this case of securing assets, securing information, more difficult, because we almost forget what it is we're trying to do in the first place.
So one of the first ICO fines that was issued by the British ICO was to a pharmacy because they stored their records in a shed that got wet. So the records were destroyed because of water ingress into the shed, but it's information that was damaged, not cyber that was damaged. But the ICO stepped in and said, you've lost those records, therefore you will be fined. So once again, information trumps.
Yeah, and I also think that if we go back to cybersecurity, lots of people in the past have said, well, you know, if you get people to think about their own personal security, it'll help them when they come to work. And
yeah,
I think that's not true. I actually think, yeah, I don't think it's true. I think people know. It's along the lines of, you know, you're driving past a fire station and you're on a dual carriageway, right? And you're supposed to go 30. And I have never followed anybody that was going at 30. Everybody was going at 40 miles and above, right? And it's just one of those, you know, it's like we know how to drive, but we all know we're doing wrong. And so therefore that's a different type of security than I have my mobile phone and one of my dumbass mates sends me a link and says, "Did you see this?" And I go, you know, I go back and go, "Did you mean to send me that?" Or I ring them or whatever. That's my personal security. I think because we are in another state of maturity. I'm at the view now. You have to accept people know when they're doing wrong. And I think we have to go more towards accountability and more towards actually laying out what the risks are and providing people with the guidelines and the rules.
Robbie, if you're doing 40 in a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, you're speaking to the guy from National Highways here. I'm pretty sure that he's got some telemetry data.
This is a hypothetical situation. This is hypothetical.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So the interesting thing about that, Robert, is if you know that you're breaking the rules, then you're consciously choosing the level of risk that you're taking, versus if you didn't know there was any rules, you might take even more risks.
So I agree with you, Matt. I'm not against education. I just think that we've come to the point where you have to separate out the two, and the communication styles that are fit for older people and younger people are completely different to the communication styles that go in the workplace.
At the risk of us running out of time, I just want a one-line response each from you, if that's possible, with regards to the supply chain challenge. What would be, Robbie, your first or your main takeaway to help our audience today better comprehend the challenges that maybe they are aware of, maybe some that they aren't aware of with regards to their supply chain, and maybe think about taming that risk?
I think that just like your incident management overall strategy, you need to be able to map out what your ecosystem is, and then, you know, focus in on those really, really crucial suppliers and make sure that you're comfortable with the level of risk that they pose for you.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've seen some organizations take a simple view to this of bronze, silver, and gold, where they're saying this is a gold supplier and we need to be absolutely diligent with this. This is a paperclip supplier. They can have a bronze. We don't really need that much for them. And is it perfect? No. Is it better than what most organizations are doing? I'd say probably is, because to get to the point of making that categorization means a lot of understanding and investigation has to take place, and you've got to understand your information.
Indeed. Wise tips from you both. We'll call it a day there for now, though. Matt, great to have you on the show with us here today. Is there anywhere where people can find out more about your work, your insights, your musings on the current state of AI and where it might be taking us next?
Yes, you can look me up on LinkedIn.
Good stuff. And Robbie, in the new series of your Netflix-style drama, Cyber Police, does the spectre of information security management amongst different parties rear its head?
Yes. And actually, this is a big month for us, David, as Series 3 is released at the end of this month. And we decided to go global, so we took our problems and hacks to Denmark, which had its own challenges. So yeah, it's full of all the good stuff, and it's people are quietly waiting for it to land on their systems.
Well, I'm sure heading over to the Meta Compliance website will give you all you need to know about
Correct.
season 3 of Cyber Police. But for now, thank you for joining us, Matt.
Very welcome. It's good fun.
And thank you for joining us, Robbie.
Thanks, David.
And thank you all for tuning in today too. Until next time, bye-bye.